In June 1812, the young United States declares war on the greatest power in the world, Great Britain. The war would last 2.5 years and would be fought in the north, on the seas, and on the coasts of the fledgling nation. Tensions between the two nations had first boiled over in the Chesapeake Incident. At this time, the homeland of Britain was threatened. Napoleon and the British had been at their titanic struggle for a long time now, and it wasn't going well for the British. The only thing preventing an invasion of the British Isles was the strong British Navy, a navy which had 120,000 men in service and lost some 15,000 men per year, or roughly 12%. This navy blockaded mainland Europe in what was called the Continental Blockade. This was only intermittently effective, but did occasionally hinder trade into Europe. The US at this time had attempted to stay neutral between the two warring powers. The British, however, weren't having any of this. They would frequently come aboard American ships and either seize the ship itself if it hadn't paid its tariffs despite not trading in the UK, or would impress sailors at random into their navy. One important thing to note here is that being a sailor in the British Navy wasn't a good thing at this time. There was no contract end date. You often simply served until you died. There was a very strong chance you'd never leave the ship you served on, and your wages would likely never be fully paid. It was slavery at best, a death sentence at worst. So now you can see why the British couldn't find enough men to crew their own ships. The official line from the Navy was that they were simply returning deserters to their rightful place in the Navy, and they did have a big deserter problem, many of whom would later go on to become American merchant sailors. But the thought that British officers could identify deserters by sight is laughable. In reality, they would come aboard and grab a few men with British-sounding last names to serve in the Navy. This boiled over when the HMS Leopard attempted to board and search the USS Chesapeake off the American coast. The American captain refused, so the British opened fire without warning, killing 3, impressing 4, and wounding 18. Following this, the drums of war began to pound in Washington. However, this was impractical without a strong, unified federal military. This spurned the expansion of the United States Navy, but did little to unite the fragmented state militias that made up the U.S. ground forces. Now the year is 1812. With their treatment by the British continuing, the American Congress has finally acquiesced to war. The first showdown of this new war would be at Mackinac Island. The American commander had not received news of the war and was surprised to awake to a British and Indian force laying siege to his fort, which fell without a fight. The U.S. plan was to wage war against the British colony of Canada, and 3 invasion forces were prepared, 1 from Michigan and 2 from New York. Sir George Prevost and Isaac Brock led the small British defense force of only 12,000 regulars with 4,000 militia, as well as their Indian allies led by the legendary Tecumseh. The Americans had not treated the Indians they encountered well, so it came as no surprise that the Indians chose to fight with the British, who had, by comparison, treated them fairly, honoring treaties and expanding far less than the U.S. had. William Hull, a Revolutionary War veteran, would lead the American offensive of 7,000 regulars and tens of thousands of militiamen. The first confrontation would occur in Michigan, as the British Army and their Indian allies seized the initiative and laid siege to Fort Detroit. As a ploy, the British dressed militia in spare uniforms to make them appear as regulars, then marched their Indians past the fort 3 times to make it appear as though they had thousands of more men than they did. In reality, the numbers are 1,300 outnumbered British versus 2,200 American soldiers. A siege ensued, with the British bombarding the fort. After a short while, the will of General Hull disintegrated, and he raised the white flag. This is the only time in history an American fort on American soil has surrendered to a foreign power. The first American attack occurred at Queenstown. 3,500 Americans fought 1,300 British. The Americans attempted an amphibious landing across the river, but had only 13 boats. Under heavy fire, the regulars took the heights on the far side of the river. Brock led a counterattack, but was killed almost immediately, and his attack repelled. A native force then stealthily flanked the American position and launched a second counterattack. These natives so scared the American irregulars on the far side of the river that they refused to cross and help the regulars. The state militia still held their loyalty only to their state and didn't view a war on foreign soil as part of their job description. 1,000 American regulars were captured and the attack failed. The third prong of the American attack met with such confusion that they fired on each other, then refused to cross the border into Canada. The US thought this would be easy. Madison had called the taking of Canada a mere matter of marching, and now it ended up being one of the biggest debacles in American military history. Meanwhile, the US never expected to be able to challenge the British at sea, yet that's exactly what would happen. The British Navy had 100 ships of the line, 200 frigates, and scores of sloops, brigs, and gunboats. The American Navy had just 8 frigates. These American frigates were special, however. Built as pocket battleships, they had more guns and men than a normal frigate, but were lighter and faster than a ship of the line. The idea being that they could outfight a frigate, but also outrun a battleship if need be. Lastly, they had a unique wood composite hull of 2 different types of wood sandwiched together. This made them particularly resilient. Just off the coast, the first naval showdown was taking place, where there was some brief chases. The outgunned Americans had so far eluded the British fleets, until the HMS Guerriere came face to face with the USS Constitution, a one-on-one fight both captains wanted. There were 456 men and 56 guns on the Constitution compared to 272 men with 49 guns aboard the Guerriere. The Guerriere's captain was so confident in the upcoming battle, he excused the impressed Americans among his crew from the battle. The Guerriere maneuvered to take the weather gauge, going upwind to have the wind on her side. The Constitution matched, and Guerriere could not take it. Next, the Guerriere's captain instead chose to fire as he went, maneuvering away from the Constitution. The Constitution held its fire and loaded double shot, 2 cannonballs per cannon. Then, pulling alongside the Guerriere, she unleashed crushing broadsides at just 10 yards. A short-range knife fight ensued between the two for 15 minutes until the Guerriere's main mast fell. This tangled her lines and left her unable to maneuver. With their lines tangled together, both ships briefly made ready to board until the Constitution's sailors managed to cut their way free with axes. Now free to maneuver, the Constitution moved to the front of the Guerriere and began to rake her, firing cannonballs long ways. This was particularly deadly, as most damage from cannonballs came from them punching through wood and creating shrapnel. When moving long ways through the ship, the cannonballs simply had more distance to do damage, punching through more wood and moving long ways, hitting more things before exiting the ship than if it just hit the side. This meant that raking was particularly deadly. The Constitution gave deadly rakes to the Guerriere before finally moving off to patch her own sails and replace shot-off rigging. Replacing rigging was relatively easy. Replacing a mast, not so much. The British captain knew he was a sitting duck, unable to maneuver, and with the Constitution making ready for battle again, he surrendered. The first, but not the last, supposedly superior British ship to surrender to an American before the war would be over. And the war was far from over. Soon the British would march on Washington to burn her down, and yet more surprise victories would be found by the fledgling American Navy, while the Canadian debacle mounts.